All right, welcome back, everyone, to PodWavePulse, your one-stop shop for breaking down the big forces moving and shaking our world. We're talking military might, technological leaps and bounds, and the global economy, where it's going, what's driving it, all that.
Yeah, the stuff that really matters in the big picture.
Exactly. And today, we're diving deep into a relationship that really sits at the intersection of all three.
Mm.
The growing tension, the apprehension, you could even say, between the United States and China. We're going to pull apart the threads here. Why is this happening? What's fueling it? We'll be looking at history, economics, military developments, the whole nine yards. So if you want to get beyond the headlines and understand the core issues, you're in the right place.
We're going deep on this one, not just scratching the surface, getting down to those foundational elements, the really complex dynamics that are shaping this relationship.
Perfect. So let's start with the history. I mean, this apprehension didn't just appear out of thin air, right? It's been building.
No, definitely not. It's been a long process. Like our sources point out, there's been a real evolution here, from Cold War containment to a period where things felt like they were getting more interconnected, more interdependent.
Yeah.
And now, well, now it feels like we're moving into a rivalry.
And the Cold War, I mean, that seems like a really crucial starting point, right? That sets the stage in a lot of ways.
It really does. If you look back, the U.S. approach to China was very much framed by that Cold War mentality. It was all about containing communism, and China was a major player in that global chessboard.
Makes sense.
Then comes the 1970s, and you have this huge shift, normalization of relations. It opens up this massive opportunity for economic cooperation.
Yeah.
But fast forward to the 21st century, and you see China's economy booming, like really booming, and their foreign policy, it's getting more assertive, more confident, and that's brought tensions right back to the surface.
So it's like this post-Cold War honeymoon period is over.
You can say that. And what's interesting is how that Cold War lens still influences how some people in the U.S. view China's rise. It's not just seen as another country getting stronger. There's this deeper anxiety,
Deeper anxiety, like what?
like it's seen as a challenge, not just to American power, but to American values, to the whole international order that the U.S. has been leading for decades.
Okay, yeah, I see what you mean. It's like this fundamental clash of visions for the world.
Exactly.
All right, let's talk economics. This is where things get really tangled, right? We're deeply connected, but also competing like crazy.
Absolutely. At the beginning, when China started opening up, there was this clear sense in the U.S. of, hey, there's a huge opportunity here for economic cooperation. But even then, our sources show there were some voices saying, hold on, are we sure about this? What are the risks of empowering a country like China?
Yeah, the risks versus rewards calculation.
Right. And then the trade agreements that followed, they definitely led to growth on both sides. But for the U.S., it also brought a lot of anxiety about jobs going overseas and this growing trade deficit.
And speaking of trade, we have to talk about the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. It was partly designed to counter China's economic influence in Asia, but the U.S. pulled out in 2017. What kind of impact did that have?
Oh, huge impact. The TPP was envisioned as this major economic bloc setting high standards for trade, labor, the whole package. The idea was that it would be tough for China to match those standards right away. The U.S. Trade Representative at the time was very clear that these agreements were about America competing and innovating while making sure workers in partner countries were treated fairly. It was a very strategic move. But when the U.S. pulled out, it definitely weakened that potential counterbalance to China.
Interesting. So let's shift gears to the military side of things. This is where the U.S. is really watching China's every move, right?
100%. The big worry for the U.S. is losing its military edge. China's been modernizing its forces like crazy, especially its Navy and Air Force. And that's raising anxieties about potential conflicts, flashpoints like Taiwan and the South China Sea.
Yeah, those are the hot spots everyone's talking about.
Exactly. And our sources make an interesting point about timing. When a country unveils new military tech, it can be a delicate balancing act.
Like trying to send a message without provoking anyone?
Yeah, it's about deterrence, right?
Okay.
Showing strength but not being too aggressive. If you roll out some new superweapon during a crisis, it could scare your opponent off. But it could also make things worse. It's a high-stakes game of signaling, and communication is key.
High stakes indeed. And with this power shift happening, it seems like the U.S. is having to rethink its entire military playbook.
Absolutely. They're shifting their focus to make sure they can still deter any potential aggression, but also to be ready to respond quickly and decisively if things go south. So it's a lot about staying ahead technologically and making sure their forces are ready to move at a moment's notice.
Agile, adaptable.
Exactly.
Okay, back to economics for a minute. Our sources really highlight intellectual property theft and forced technology transfer as major sticking points for the U.S.
This is a big one. The argument from the U.S. is that these practices are basically undermining the foundation of American innovation. They're saying that China isn't protecting foreign companies' intellectual property and that they're forcing these companies to share valuable technology if they want to do business in China.
So it's like playing by a different set of rules.
Exactly. And it's not just about fairness. It's about the long-term economic competitiveness of the U.S.
And then there's the trade deficit. It's been growing, especially since COVID. Our sources point to this as a major concern for the long-term health of the U.S. economy.
Yeah, a trade deficit basically means the U.S. is buying a lot more from China than it's selling. And that raises concerns about whether this relationship is sustainable. Will it hurt American businesses and jobs in the long run? That's the question.
It's a big question. One of our sources even links over 2.7 million U.S. job losses between 2001 and 2011 to this trade imbalance. That's a lot of jobs.
It is. Now, economists have different views on whether those job losses are directly tied to the trade deficit, but it definitely shows how serious this issue is seen in the U.S.
So what did the U.S. do? They slapped tariffs on Chinese goods, right?
They did, but our sources suggest those tariffs had mixed results. American consumers ended up paying higher prices, and there were disruptions to supply chains. It wasn't a magic bullet.
So more unintended consequences.
Right. Tariffs are meant to protect domestic industries, but they can also backfire. If you make imported goods more expensive, it hits businesses and consumers who rely on them.
And it wasn't just consumers feeling the pain. American farmers were hit hard by retaliatory tariffs from China.
Oh, absolutely. Agriculture really took a hit. China's a huge market for American farm products, and when they slapped tariffs on those products in response, it hurt American farmers badly. Exports went down and a lot of farmers struggled.
So it's like a trade war with casualties on both sides.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Another sticking point is this requirement for foreign companies in China to share technology or form joint ventures. This seems especially sensitive when you're talking about military tech like AI and semiconductors.
This is a huge source of friction. The U.S. is worried that China is using this forced technology transfer to boost its own military development. They're basically taking the knowledge and innovation of foreign companies and using it to catch up, especially in sensitive areas like AI and semiconductors.
So it's like a shortcut to military power?
Yeah, you can see it that way. And the U.S. isn't just sitting back. The Department of Commerce has put export controls on advanced tech, especially in computing and semiconductors.
So they're trying to limit what China can get its hands on.
Exactly. They're trying to slow down China's military modernization and protect America's technological edge.
This economic rivalry is pretty intense, and our sources say it's making companies rethink their entire supply chains. There's even more scrutiny on European tech investments in China. It feels like the global economy is being reshaped.
That's a great point. All this uncertainty and tension is making businesses around the world nervous. They're looking at their supply chains, which are often heavily reliant on China, and thinking, do we need to diversify? Should we be looking elsewhere? And yeah, there's definitely more caution around investing in Chinese tech, especially from countries that are close to the U.S.
All right, let's dive into the specifics of China's military modernization. Their goal is to make the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, a world-class force. That's a pretty ambitious goal.
It is, but it's right there in their national strategy. They want a military that can rival the best in the world. It's about projecting power globally, protecting their interests.
So they're thinking big.
Big picture, yeah. And one of the key tools in their arsenal is this idea of military-civil fusion. Basically, they're blurring the lines between civilian and military tech. They're taking innovations from the private sector, stuff like AI, advanced computing, new materials, and they're finding military applications for it.
So it's like a fast track for military innovation.
Exactly. And they're really focusing on AI. They see its potential to revolutionize warfare, autonomous weapons, better intelligence gathering, more efficient command and control. The U.S. military is definitely taking notice.
AI is a game changer, for sure. And our sources point out that PLA doctrine is already anticipating potential intervention by a powerful enemy, basically the U.S. and its allies, in a scenario like a conflict over Taiwan.
This is at the core of Chinese military thinking. They assumed the U.S. would get involved if things got hot over Taiwan. So they're building their strategies around that assumption. How do they prevent the U.S. from intervening? How do they neutralize that threat?
And that's where deterrence comes in, right? Making the costs of intervention so high that the U.S. would think twice.
Exactly. They're developing advanced capabilities, showing off their new toys, basically trying to make it clear to the U.S. that getting involved would be a huge risk.
Right.
They want to raise the stakes, make the potential losses unacceptable.
That's a high-stakes poker game.
For sure. And our sources emphasize that the U.S. needs to get its Asian allies more involved in strategic planning. Going it alone isn't enough anymore.
So it's about building coalitions, strengthening alliances.
Exactly. The U.S. can't just rely on its own military power in the Indo-Pacific. They need strong partnerships in the region to counter China's growing influence.
And that's where the complexity comes in, right? Balancing U.S. interests with the interests of its allies, who might have different economic and security ties to China.
It's a juggling act. Not all U.S. allies see China in the same way. Some are more economically dependent on China, others have different security concerns. The U.S. has to navigate those differences carefully if they want to present a united front.
All right, let's talk about the ideological differences. This seems like a fundamental source of tension between the U.S. and China. The U.S. sees China as an authoritarian state with a poor human rights record.
That's a key part of the U.S. perspective. They see this clash of values, a clash of systems. They criticize China's one-party rule, its limits on free speech and freedom of religion, its treatment of minorities.
And China doesn't just take this criticism lying down, right? They fire back with their own criticisms of the U.S.
Oh yeah, it's a two-way street. They point to issues in the U.S., things like surveillance, the way prisoners are treated, gun violence, homelessness.
So it's like a battle of narratives, each side trying to discredit the other.
Exactly. And it plays out on the global stage. It's about winning hearts and minds, influencing international opinion.
And our sources mention how Chinese state media used events like the George Floyd protests to portray the U.S. system as hypocritical and undermine its credibility.
That's a really interesting point. They're taking domestic issues in the U.S. and using them to push their own geopolitical agenda. They're trying to show the world that the U.S. is flawed, divided, not the shining example of democracy it claims to be.
So it's about exploiting weaknesses, sowing doubt.
Exactly. And it feeds into this broader ideological clash, this sense that China is a fundamental challenge to American values.
Let's move on to cybersecurity. The breach of the U.S. Treasury Department systems in December 2024 was a wake-up call. This is a whole other dimension of the threat.
Absolutely. It shows how persistent and sophisticated Chinese cyber espionage can be. They exploited a vulnerability in a third-party provider to get access to sensitive information, even if it wasn't top secret.
It's scary how vulnerable we can be, even with all the security measures in place.
Yeah. Compromising a digital key can give hackers a backdoor into systems. It bypasses all the traditional defenses.
And our sources say this attack was traced back to a China-linked APT, an advanced persistent threat group. These are the pros, right?
Yeah, APTs are highly organized, well-resourced groups, often state-sponsored. This wasn't just some random hacker in their basement.
This is serious stuff, and it seems like cyber threats are now right up there with traditional military threats in terms of U.S. strategic thinking.
You're absolutely right. The world is so interconnected now, cyber attacks can have huge consequences. They can disrupt critical infrastructure, steal secrets, paralyze entire systems. It's a whole new battlefield.
Okay, last but not least, let's talk about global influence and diplomacy. Our sources point out that China's growing military power and its expanding diplomatic reach are shaking things up in the Asia-Pacific and beyond. U.S. allies are definitely feeling the pressure.
It's a power shift in action. China's military is getting stronger, and they're more active on the world stage. They're building relationships, making deals, and it's changing the balance of power. Countries that have traditionally aligned with the U.S. are having to adjust.
And it's complicated by the fact that many Asian countries are deeply economically intertwined with China.
That's a key point. It's not a simple black and white situation. A lot of countries in the region rely on China for trade and investment. They might share some of the U.S.'s security concerns, but they're not going to completely turn their backs on China.
So it's a delicate balancing act for them.
Exactly. They're trying to manage this complex web of relationships. And some people are calling for a more coordinated approach, a coalition of the willing among U.S. partners.
So basically banding together to counter China's influence and reduce dependence on them.
Exactly. It's about finding strength in numbers, creating alternative economic and security networks.
And China's advancements in military AI are adding to the tension. It's creating what they call a security dilemma, where everyone feels like they have to arm themselves to keep up.
It's a classic arms race dynamic.
Right.
If China develops powerful AI weapons, its neighbors feel threatened, and they have to respond by building up their own capabilities. And that can create a spiral of escalation.
So it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy.
You could say that. And for the U.S., it means they have to rely even more on their allies in the region. They can't project power effectively without strong partnerships.
It's a team effort now.
Exactly.
Finally, let's touch on public opinion in the U.S. Our sources say there's a growing negative view of China, fueled by concerns about human rights, trade practices, and their military buildup.
Public opinion matters.
Yeah.
It shapes policy. And there's definitely a sense in the U.S. that China's a problem. They see the human rights abuses, the unfair trade practices, the growing military threat. It's all adding up to a negative image.
And the media plays a role in shaping that image, right?
Of course. The way China is portrayed in the U.S. media and the way the U.S. is portrayed in Chinese media, it all contributes to this sense of rivalry and distrust.
And then you have incidents like the U.S. designating some Chinese state media outlets as foreign missions. That definitely didn't help.
That was a big deal. It was basically saying, we don't see these outlets as legitimate news organizations. We see them as propaganda arms of the Chinese government.
So it's another layer of tension, another barrier to understanding.
Absolutely. And then there's the issue of online disinformation. Our sources point to evidence of Chinese actors trying to manipulate racial tensions in the U.S. and damage America's reputation internationally.
So it's a battle for hearts and minds playing out online.
Yeah, it's information warfare. They're trying to sow division, create chaos, undermine trust in the U.S. system.
It's a messy situation.
Very messy. And the bottom line is public opinion in the U.S. has shifted. China is now seen as both a competitor and a challenge to American values.
So the stakes are high.
Extremely high.
Well, that was a whirlwind tour of a very complex relationship. We've covered a lot of ground today. History, economics, military developments, ideology, cybersecurity, global influence. It's clear that the U.S. and China are locked in a competition that's going to shape the 21st century.
No doubt about it. It's
Yeah.
one of the defining relationships of our time.
We hope this deep dive has given you a better understanding of the forces at play, the challenges, the potential flashpoints. For a deeper look, check out the Stanford analysis we use for this discussion. You can find the link in the show notes.
It's a great resource if you want to dig deeper.
Absolutely. And we want to hear from you. What are your takeaways? What questions do you have about the future of this relationship? Let us know in the comments.
Yeah, join the conversation.
And if you found this breakdown helpful, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss our future deep dives into the military, technological, and economic trends that are shaping our world. Thanks for tuning in.